Do you see a change in that in terms of female representation, role models, etc.? Do you see a difference from obviously your upbringing in Blackburn to maybe today?
Yeah, and I don't even think that even my location, as in where I'm from, was a big thing at that point, because there were maybe the help of the fact that it was quite a successful football team was a big thing, but equally the way in which the game has evolved now for females is massive. I think there's a huge opportunity for anybody who's looking to break into football. That is an angle for them. And I often tell that to any students that I come across, really, that even if you're striving for the men's game, which, I don't necessarily always favour that, but the female game in the way that it's growing and evolving now is a way to do that. And I think some of that is because there's more role models, there's more people that aren't just necessarily playing football, but actually doing stuff behind the scenes in football. And one thing that I've come across in particular is that if you're a female, it's automatically assumed that you work in female football. And that happens all the time. So the majority of my career has been spent in the male game. But as soon as you kind of go down the route of explaining what role you do, the automatic assumption is, oh, for the females. And then you've got to obviously correct them and say, no, but I'm in a position now where I do work with females, so that's not such the case.
Talk to me about, obviously, you mentioned kind of your upbringing and then the male game you mentioned then. How did that come about? And obviously that hobby turning into a career and a passion and something that you're intrinsically driven by. How did that all kind of make sense for you and become apparent?
I think it's a really strange one for me, because some people always ask me, like, where do you get your drive from? And so a lot of people ask me that. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I give people the answer that I think is the right answer, not necessarily the actual answer. And for me, in terms of my upbringing in Blackburn, my upbringing was very different, I would say, but probably, sadly, quite relatable to a lot of people. So I was, born to a very young mum, which then kind of brought a very different family dynamic. Football-wise, from a dad's perspective, I don't know if I should say this, but my dad actually went to prison when I was young,
right.
And was there for a good 5 or 6 years of my childhood. So I never had that kind of male influence, and people often think if you're a female playing football, you've had that kind of male influence to sway you in that direction. That wasn't the case. But equally, I don't actually know where the football bit came from. I think it's just that I was in a particular position where a town that loved football, I was within a family environment that didn't shy away from football, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm from a family that is big into football. So it's a really strange kind of where did it come from question, but equally it's something that caught my interest. And I think what I took from the sporting environment was that actually that was a way for me, I guess from a social perspective, to build friendships and also interact with people that probably within my own school setting had similar sort of upbringings to me. So it built a different connection for me with people in the sense of they're my friends, but the thing in common is sport. Yeah. And that was kind of, I think, how it evolved, really.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of the element of bringing people together, that social and as well as psychological collaboration is so integral within sport. Sometimes it's kind of missed, Obviously, when you think of coaches, the technical, tactical coaching element, but obviously the social and psychological factors that you just mentioned then are so significant to inspire you to have a career.
Yeah, they're massive. And even when, even now when you're talking to students from, analysis or scouting, talent ID perspectives, psychology is like one of the big parts that you're looking for in players, and arguably it's really difficult to measure when it's not you. But when you actually get down to it, every single thing that a player does is psychologically driven. So the decision to kick the ball at a certain time, the way in which you kick the ball is stemmed from the decision you're making in your mind. So everything is driven by psychology. It's just that we often section it into these other brackets to be able to measure it in a slightly different way. So fundamentally, the way in which you think about something is going to come out in the execution of it. And I think for me, sort of then pulling that back to the social side of things, that is clearly how I thought about sport. I thought it's a mechanism for other stuff. It's a mechanism for having a connection with a person. It's a mechanism for, now looking back, I can kind of see where part of my personality has been brought out through sport. And, you know, it's not the greatest thing to admit, but I am quite stubborn at times. I am quite driven, but to the point that I sometimes won't let things go. And I think that's the competitiveness. I think that's where that comes from. But it's not a conscious thought. It's not something I think about. It's just, I can relate it to that point and that moment.
Well, why scouting then? So you mentioned obviously these experiences at a young age. You know, there's so many different avenues today, maybe in comparison to what it was previously. And you mentioned that the difference between male and female. But why scouting? Why did that become an area for you to exploit and grow and become an expert in?
Do you know what, if I'm honest, I was never exposed to it throughout my years of studying, because at the time it wasn't really a thing. It wasn't a sector that people thought they could get into. And what's happened now is the avenues have opened. And I graduated, I guess, from aside from my PhD, my other qualifications, I think I finished in 2011 or 2013. Up to that point, scouting was never sort of popularised as an option. It was always other things, so coaching or performance analysis or sports science. Yeah. So it was always those things. And even as one of those students that was part of programs like that, you could kind of see transferability across them things. So for me, scouting was never mentioned. Analysis was mentioned. And I kind of already knew that that's where I wanted to go. And I kind of saw it as a combination. So my background prior to higher education, so between school and higher education, I didn't do A-levels. I went and did an apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship I did was in the NHS, in IT support.
All right.
So I kind of had a background in technology and understanding IT pretty much. My love of sport never went away. And there just came a point where I had like a health complication and I couldn't play sport because of that. I wasn't bothered about my course that I was on, which was computing. I was bothered about not being able to play football. And that made me think, this is the thing I'm missing, not where I'm trying to carve my career into something that clearly I don't want to be doing. That then allowed me to see, well, can I combine these two things? And that's where analysis felt like the right fit. It's a combination of technology, but also sport. Mm. So I was like, this is perfect, and it feels the right thing for me. And as soon as I got that in my mind, it's not necessarily anything that I got rid of. It was just there. And as soon as I was then into kind of a university program that allowed me to explore sport and analysis, and it introduced me to kind of the right way to do things, I then started to look for options to be able to practice that. And I was very fortunate that at the time, in my undergrad degree, I went and worked with Bolton and Blackburn within their academy and eventually within Bolton's first team, because they were fighting relegation at the time. And again, Bolton were in the Premier League, so it was quite a long time ago. So that for me highlighted, this is where I wanted to go. And that was the career I wanted. The career I wanted was to be in a club doing analysis. But life don't work like that. Yeah. So I was then in a position, because this was kind of a booming sector. I was coming fresh out of university. The university recognised that this was a growing area for students. What that created was an opportunity at that university to become a demonstrator, because that was an area that was booming. they had nobody to teach students about how to use the kit and the software, so they had to rely on people that have just pretty much done it fresh out of the university program. And that's what I became. So I became the demonstrator at the university that I graduated from. And I kind of then got, I guess, sucked into the academic side. Never my plan. Never wanted to teach. Never on my radar. I just wanted to be in a club. And I would never change that. I would never change that, because what has come with something that I never even considered is the ability to obviously develop for me personally. I feel like I've grown massively across, I think I've been in education now just under 20 years. That's grown massively. Being able to kind of share the different facets and experiences I've had with people and then actually see them go on and do something is for me is quite a big thing. But I still had that niggle in my mind that I wanted to be in a club, always.
Why?
I felt like I was missing out. So FOMO, pretty much. FOMO, but also I wanted to make sure that the things that I was teaching was up to date.
Yeah.
And especially in that sector, it's so fast-paced. If you take your foot off the gas for a second, something new will come out or something different will be happening. And I was very much aware of that. So I guess from a reflection point of view, I think I'm quite good at that. But I wanted to keep my toe in the water of something that has always been my aim. But actually, I kind of had the best of both worlds. I had the stability of academia, and I still had the option to be a practitioner and do the things that actually I set out to be doing that I didn't end up doing. And what that did for me was kind of, again, at this point, scouting was not on my radar at all. And because it still wasn't a thing. And eventually through my experiences going outside the university and getting more practitioner-based experiences, my role within analysis started to change slightly. So I'd be introduced to different types of analysis, so opposition analysis, for example. So certain weekends I'd be going out watching the team that we'd be playing the week after and trying to understand ways in which we can beat that team when we come to play them. And this is where it started to shift slightly, because it allowed me to see the transferability of the skills that I picked up as an analyst. So I remember one occasion where I got asked to go and watch some players, and it was fine. There's no training at this point, so no one's told me like, this is what you do, this is how you look for them, this is the type of stuff you're looking for. So this particular club I was working for at the time, but we didn't have a blueprint of the type of player that they wanted. We just had kind of enough knowledge to know what the team looked like at the minute, and that was hopefully enough to then start to build new additions in. And I went to my first game, went to scout some players, and I actually realised that this takes nowhere near as long as doing performance analysis type work. And that for me was a massive win, because I just spent, you have your whole week in academia teaching, planning, prepping, marking, meeting students, and then you spend your weekend doing the analysis. And when I was doing first team analysis, that would mean you would have to be at the ground way before kick-off, going through the actual game. Then you've got obviously the end of the game. Then you'd spend the whole next day doing the reports, ready to feed back for training on Monday, which is the whole weekend. That's gone. What I was noticing with scouting is that you obviously were going to the games. You could probably get there maybe 30 minutes before kick-off, watch the game. The reports might take you an hour. So it was a no-brainer from a time perspective. And this is by no means to put anybody off analysis. I absolutely think it's a really good starting point for people to get into scouting. Because my view was that the way into scouting was you have to have played in football. And I think that was just because what was presented at the time. The typical demographic in scouting, and this sadly is not any different, is quite a lot of older age men.
Yeah.
And I've not seen a female scout on the circuit yet. That's not to say that they don't exist or that there aren't any in places.
Just a quick one to let you know that over 90% of those that watch this channel do not subscribe. So if you haven't already, please click the subscribe button down below. The bigger the channel, the bigger the guests, and more importantly, it's absolutely free. Enjoy the episode.
Can I ask you a question on that then? So you mentioned analysis and how that's kind of grown, and you said you're at the very start of the growth of analysis. Again, the vision of a performance analysis probably at the beginning is probably just a person with a camera. Yeah? So obviously that there's a misconception already. And then you mentioned the nature of people working in sport, males. Obviously in your case you're a female. How did you cope with that? And was that ever challenged at all, or was that ever looked at in a critical way?
From an analyst perspective, I wouldn't say I felt it. There was one experience that I came across that I just so happened to be told about. So it wasn't a kind of direct experience. There was a situation when I was still at university in my final year, and I applied for a position, and I was about to get offered an interview, and then they saw my name at the top of my CV, and then it didn't happen. That's the only instance that I personally am aware of where there's been a gender issue. In terms of scouting, again, the people you work with, I've never ever come across any sort of discrimination or anything like that. The people's perceptions of who you meet out and about at games that are nothing to do with football have a view.
Right.
As an example, it will be people like players' parents.
Okay.
Or, believe it or not, the man in the burger van. It's true. This has happened. And you'll say, you know, if you go to a game, for example, and you've got the kit on, they'll obviously recognise that and say, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Because it's like it won't be saying anything to do with that club from their point of view. And you'll say, "Oh, I'm scouting for them." You're a scout. That and I've had that once internally as well with a club where I was going into kind of like a big CPD event that happened annually, and I was actually with a group of the men that were the scouts as well, and we just happened to be walking into the building at the same time, and the security person was kind of saying, you know, "But where are you going?" So we told them, "You scout," and it's just that kind of singling out that, yeah. But and you know, fortunately for me, like I've never took it in any particular, you know, with any malice or anything. Yeah. But I can easily see how it could be, you know, taken that way. And then the men that were with me at the time, you know, they were very kind of like, you know, defensive, which was nice. But yeah, it's very daunting, I would probably say. But also, there's an element of you feeling like you have to justify yourself a bit more and show that you've earned the right to be in that room.
Right.
Yeah.
Just on the process of scouting then. So you mentioned one of the first games you went to, you know, there was no blueprint. It was just go and just have a look at this individual or this team and find out and report back, and hopefully that comes out with something. What do you look for then if you are going through the process today? Is it more structured? And can you maybe give some insight on what it would look like for you if you're going to watch a game or you're looking at a certain individual? Could you just give some insight there for those that might be thinking about the career of scouting?
So a lot of it will depend on the club in terms of, you know, what their blueprint is, what their profile is. An example would be Chelsea, for example. Apparently the keepers have to be the mould of Petr Cech. Like that's and they match it profile to profile.
Right.
Some clubs don't do that. Some clubs are very much kind of, it depends on whether they're a technical based team or tactical. It depends kind of what the profile is of the team. a few things that I've picked up that's really useful, regardless of where you work in, is kind of the understanding that maturation is important. Understanding what that means and at what ages and where you're expecting to see over or under development of players. That's a huge one, because you can often make a judgment on a player based on their physicality, because they're up against a boy who's overdeveloped, for example, and all of a sudden that kid looks weaker. So if you don't have that understanding of maturation, you'll make inaccurate judgments on players. Another one for me that's really important in the female game is the menstruation cycles.
Right.
Like, they're so key in the sense of what you would then see on the pitch. And this is something that I brought into some of the masters programs at UCFB, but also some of the teaching I do for the PFSA, were understanding the different phases of the female cycles. You can then translate into what you would then see on the pitch from those players. And I'll give you an example of this. So 4 phases to the typical cycle for a female. What a lot of males find shocking to hear is that this is going on for pretty much the majority of a female's life, let alone, as a performer, but just as a person. And this cycle's never ending. It just goes round and round and round. So what we're trying to understand more is what is happening in each phase of these cycles that actually is affecting them enough that you would then see in performance output. Typically what tends to happen, so phase 1, for example, is the phase in which the females themselves actually know about it. So that's when they actually get the symptoms themselves. And research suggests that cognition in females is higher at this point. So as a scout, for example, I might go and watch a player who's in that phase, start seeing them being more creative on the ball, a bit more of a risk taker. The passes they make are just a bit more, they just look smart. And that could be indicative of where they are in that cycle. Equally, if we flip through to phase 3, for example, which is quite a substantial period of, no pun intended, of that particular phase, your heart rate is naturally increased, which means that your breathing's affected. So obviously when you're running around the pitch, you might report on players looking a little bit sluggish, looking a bit lazy. And actually, biologically, that's just what is the outcome of that. So the impact for females is huge in football. And that is kind of, from a scouting perspective, where it goes beyond just the things that people tend to look for on the surface. And it's the understanding of, well, why you're looking for these things and what does it actually mean.
That's really interesting. Again, me thinking from an outsider looking in at scouting, that didn't cross my mind. And again, I don't know if that's maybe because you were a female and you understand maybe these things. It could be useful in that sense.
One sort of myth I would put with that comment is, don't assume that females understand menstrual cycles. Because, as I said before, females are only aware of the actual physical symptom they get, which is one phase of the 4. All those other 3 phases, it's all internal changes that are happening that females will probably put down to, that's just how I feel, and that's just my pattern of how I feel, what I go through. But actually there's a biology behind it, which is you're feeling that way because of this. And then it's, how does that then translate onto the football field? If I flip that to men, one thing I always say is, if a male performer was put on medication, for example, that had a, what do they call it? Kind of a symptom of taking this medication. It might be, you're going to be fatigued. Don't be doing this. And you might then see that in the male performer. So it kind of feels sometimes that in male football, if things like that are implemented, they're noticed. Or the medical team will be like, they're on a certain medication and it has an impact on this. Well, females aren't on medication. That's still happening. So it does feel like there's still loads of work to be done, and there is a lot being done in the female side on that. But this is obviously where they're also starting now to align it to things like the ACL injuries as well, and the hormone fluctuations.
How do you go into a scouting session and avoid biases then? So there might be people that go, watch this person, they can do this, this and this. However, they act and do certain things that are not to maybe that level that you need to consider. And all of a sudden it's like you've got that in the back of your brain subconsciously. How do you go into the process of trying to be neutral, trying to be fair, and scouting effectively to ensure that you have a clear understanding of the individual?
I think it's impossible. And I think it's impossible just because that's who we are as people. As soon as anybody says anything, you automatically create that judgment of what that means to you. What I would therefore say is it's about reducing the bias. And reducing the bias can take some really simple forms. I often went down the premise of the less I know, the better. So I don't really want to be listening to other people talking. I want to make it a judgment based on what I'm seeing or what I've seen in the past. That's not always possible because sometimes you're just given information. But I think if you can tally that up with some of the points that I just made around kind of the education side and the understanding of if we take boys football, for example, the maturation rates, that's quite a key one. What I sometimes see is you get some scouts in the game that are relatively new to it. They haven't necessarily had that level of explanation about the impact of something like maturation, and they'll go out to a game. They'll pick a boy who's the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful, the most confident boy, and then you've got this really small boy, really stand out. They're very much chalk and cheese on the pitch. But what you notice in the small boy is the technical competency is really good. And it's kind of around that education piece of, would you recommend the powerful, the strong, the confident one, who maybe does get the goals as well, or the smaller boy who's technically actually very good? I would always go with the smaller boy. And the reason being is because he's going to catch up. So the physicality bit will come in time. The technical bit is something that he hasn't neglected, whereas the boy who's more powerful, more confident to go forward, he might have neglected that because he thinks, well, I've got the power, I've got the pace, I've got the confidence. Why do I need to be working on stuff if people are already looking at me? And I kind of feel like that would be neglected in sometimes players like that. So as a scout looking in on a situation like that, if you don't have that understanding of the physical development, when it's likely to come, even, it's quite a common thing, but people say, look at the parents. My argument with that is, how do you know the biological parents? You don't know that. So it's there as kind of an indicator, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's the out and out indicator of what you're looking for. So I think you need people that have that kind of understanding of not just what are we looking for, but why are we looking for it? And also the indicators for potential, not just on performance.
Do you ever see any, again, it's a really interesting point, obviously, from a stereotypical point of view, you see, I think there was a study done in Spain around commentary and describing black players as fast and strong. Mm. And when they kind of come up with the statistics, it wasn't equal to what they were saying. And you mentioned the demographic of people that might be involved in scouting. Do you ever find yourself having to challenge certain stereotypes or challenge the perceptions towards scouting to maybe look at it differently or think about things differently to ensure that there's clarity on what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think it is really hard. One thing that I've found working in a club that's one of the biggest clubs in the world is that sometimes it feels like you're fighting a losing battle. Because not only are you in that sort of environment, but you're also up against a system that's been there for years and years and years. And if that's the way they've always done something, and that's the way that they've got success, I think they see it like anything else. Why would you change that? And if they're seeing the successes through the stereotyping, it's very difficult to change it. I think in terms of when I've come up against something like that, and this kind of feeds into the point of bias. It feels like they're planting that bias by doing things like that. But equally, I think if you're if you're brave enough and strong enough to be able to hold your own and say, well, actually, I don't agree with you on that. You can't just be going for that player because of your stereotyping of them. I think that's kind of what you're there to do. And one thing I've always said is that you've been employed to be your own voice, not just the spokesperson for the voices behind you. And I think that's kind of what I always try and do, which is, you pay me for my opinion, so I'll give you my opinion. If you don't like it, you don't like it. Like, it's, it's subjective, and scouting is subjective. But fundamentally, like, I'll feel a lot better knowing that I've given you a true view of what I think, regardless of your kind of stereotyping profile of players.
On reflection, obviously, your time within scouting, is there anyone or any person that you've come across, you've gone, wow, like that is really impressive, real next level quality, and have kind of maybe gone on to have a successful career? There's a chance to name drop, by the way.
Oh, no, it's... So I think the thing with academy scouting is that things take time.
Yeah.
So I get asked this question a lot. Probably the most asked question, I would say.
It's kind of the cherry on the top of the cake.
It is. It is.
The glamorous aspect.
Yeah, and there's a couple of players, obviously, in United's academy that I was part of the process of getting in, and I think one key thing before I kind of go into the detail of that is that it's not just you. It's a whole, bank of scouts. It's a whole process that you have to go through, and it's not just one person's opinion that ends up getting that person through the door. It's multiple sightings, multiple reports. Do they align? Do they kind of conflict? And then that starts to move up the chain. Is that agreed by the head of academy recruitment? Is that agreed by the head of the phase in that particular region of that age? And then ultimately, does the head of recruitment buy into it as well? So it's a long process. Probably a bit slow in my opinion. But I remember going to watch in particular Jack Kingdon, who's in the United Academy at the minute, and he actually came from Morecambe. So within my region, which was very much the northwest, but a very large chunk of the northwest, Morecambe was one of my clubs. So I saw him quite a few times, and there was kind of comments around his transitional play. So he plays in defence. He has the confidence and he's progressive enough to go forward, but he's always kind of confident enough that he can get back if there's a counter. And when you looked into his background, he had an athletics background. So there's then that kind of argument around, this is the whole view of talent detection. So this is kind of, for me, the sort of predecessor of talent identification, and that's what a lot of research is saying now, the talent detection phase, which is understanding that a lot of people that end up successful in a particular sport might not necessarily have started out in that sport. And that for me is where there's a huge part of scouts being knowledgeable enough to be able to and not blinkered really, to be able to say the future football stars are not just going to be starting in football. Let's actually have a look at where else there is. And you're hearing it more and more now that there's lads in particular in the academies, and when you get talking to people in that setup, they'll be like, oh, they're an exceptional golfer. And you think, and in football you think, well, that's not really going to be that relatable. But then when you get down to kind of like the finer skills of things, golf's got to be a very disciplined sport. There's a patience element to it. There's an accuracy element to it. So you can start to pick up all the buzzwords that actually can be filtered through to football. And that for me is something that is really kind of pivotal in a lot of players' successes. I saw the lad recently that's been signed for United, Silva, I think it is. He's a sprinter, and there's footage now all over the internet about how quick he is, and United got like the fastest under 14-year-old in the country and stuff. So that kind of, I guess, open-mindedness to talent coming from not just football is a key thing.
I like that, the sense of diversification. I was actually speaking to a rugby player in America who came from American football. Apparently rugby in the East Coast of America is growing, just for the fact that when they don't make it in American football, they've got these transferable skills. One thing I wanted to ask you, and going back to your point that you mentioned earlier ago, you mentioned subjectivity, and obviously the argument about objectivity, whether someone can make it, and again, it's your opinion. Do you have to accept that you're going to make a lot of mistakes then? Do you accept that you're going to be wrong quite a lot? Yeah. And do you have to maybe just think about that when you go into the process?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that you can get from working in football is that the majority of the time you'll be wrong. and the stats prove that. The fact that I think it's 1% of people in academies actually make it to the top.
Yeah.
So if you align yourself with that stat, 99% of the time you're going to be wrong, which is, I imagine for some people is horrendous, like having to admit you're wrong and all these sorts of things. But I think that comes down to you as a person. And if you're coming from the world of football going into something else, I think you've been more than prepared because of that expectation that you will fail. But, failure's part of how you develop, so...
How do you keep up to date with knowledge then? So you mentioned, from when you started, in analysis and obviously growing into the position that you're in today, and you mentioned, the array of football clubs that you work with. How do you keep up to date then? Because you also touched upon that you work in academia, but also you like to keep involved just to understand what's going on and then the involvement of it, and also, technologies and all these other factors that are advancing the game from different perspectives. What does scouting do to advance and improve?
I think I'm very fortunate in the sense that every single thing that I do links to each other. So scouting for United, for the men, my current role of scouting with the FA, but for the women, but that already gives me a diversity in the sense of how the men and women's game is entirely different. So I think that was a really good kind of learning curve for me. But equally, I can see how I can feed a lot of that into each other. So I don't think I would have got the role with the FA if I didn't have the United experience.
Yeah.
And they've recognised that actually if you're working at that elite level in a club like that, you will have something to bring to the table. So I think that's worked out really well. It brings sometimes an overly critical part because I'm expecting a certain standard, and then obviously when you're not seeing that, you come across as a bit harsh. So it's about then adjustment of what the expectations are at the different places that you're working out and working for. The fact that I'm in academia means that if I'm teaching students this stuff, I need to be making sure that the messaging is right. Yeah. So you're kind of sometimes forced into it as well, which is not the best word, but that's the reality of it. You're kind of forced into being up to date. But equally, as I said, I teach also for the PFSA, who are an independent educating company, which they have kind of very different, specialisms. So analysis is one of them, but talent ID is another. And I've took I suppose, a key lead for them in relation to women's football because of that. That has made me look into things like the impact of the menstrual cycle. And what I'm always thinking about is if I was on the other end of this conversation, I would want to be coming away with something. And people coming onto that course or courses here at UCFB or anywhere else really, is that there should be something that they can take away and use. And that's fundamentally it for me. And if you can then use that and implement it for change and positive change, that's the win.
How do you bring a critical sense to your work then? So everyone's got an opinion on football. Obviously the Euros are going on at the moment. Everyone's talking about the formations and who should be playing where and what. How do you bring a critical sense then? So I always call that like pub talk. Everyone's got an opinion on football. Yeah. What do you do to maybe detach yourself from that and really think critically about the game? Is there a process, or is there anything that you use? You mentioned reflection as well. Is that something that aligns with that?
I think I'm just I think naturally I am probably an overthinker actually, which I don't know if that aids or hinders my reflective part. But I think because I'm so embedded with, for example, the statistical side of sport and understanding the different profiles that you look for in players, I think all of that comes together to then, if I'm watching a game, for example, you're looking at kind of the formation changes as you go from attack to defence, so transitional type play, and you automatically start applying the things that you would look for if you were out scouting a game into that setting. believe it or not, if I don't have to watch football, I don't watch football.
Right.
Because I feel like it's everything. So if there's a point where it doesn't have to be everything, it won't be. So it's not as much now, but when I worked for United, I'd be covering about 20 games a month, which is then when you go from doing that in a month to then coming in and teaching students about football, and you're watching football with the students to teach them the things you're trying to get across, it becomes everything. So I try and step back. So it's probably not the best thing to admit, but like, I will absolutely watch England in the Euros. I won't commit to having every single game planned to watch in the Euros. I just won't do it. And it's, well, first off, you've got other things to do. But second, I don't want it to be all consuming. It is a job. And the fact that I think of, you know, right from the beginning of this conversation, I've grown up with football has helped towards that. But there's also an element of, you know, in the background of all this happening, I'm just a person that is just growing as well. So I don't want it to consume my life. I don't want it to be that way. It's hard to compartmentalize, but I'm trying to do that a bit more.
I think there's two ways of watching football. I think you can watch it from your perspective and also just watch it as a bit of a fun and the matches on and we'll go to the pub, like a social perspective. Also, I think these are kind of the thoughts that people don't recognise. You know, you might come across students, you might come across inspiring scouts that go, I really want to do that. It's a really cool job and I want to find the next Jude Bellingham or Phil Foden. But actually there's an element of sometimes it's hard to detach yourself from football. There can be a potential burnout. Yeah. You might overthink things, like you said. So it's interesting how you say that.
Yeah. No, it is. And I think people see it as a surprise when you say, no, I didn't watch that game.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, it doesn't have to be all consuming. Like I can give a bit to myself to that, but then equally I can also give a bit to myself to my actual life. And that's kind of what I want to keep. And I think in the past I haven't done that very well. I think it's took me quite a long time to be able to do that and realise how to do it. And a big sort of reasoning with that is just the ability to say no. Like, I've struggled with that probably a lot, which is I am quite an opportunistic person. So even now, like, there will be other things on the table, and it's just kind of, and it's that FOMO thing. I'm frightened of missing out, so I'll opt for it, and then I'll be like, well, I probably shouldn't have done that. And I am very much like that, so I'll always kind of keep many irons in the fire. And yeah, I think that's what keeps me going. And a big part, my PhD finishing was a big part of that. Like it took a long time, so it feels like a big void as such. And people say you actually grieve after it because it's, you're just used to it being there and then it's gone. So I think that's been a part of filling that void of what other bits could I do that help with that.
What skills would you recommend for people that are listening or watching this podcast that want to go into that part of football, that want to look at maybe recruitment strategies or looking at how to identify certain players? What skills do you think you need? Obviously, you've elaborated on some already, but is there anything that you think are necessary?
Interpersonal skills are the biggest one.
Okay.
For me, the things that you can't learn so easily are the things you should be trying to develop. So building your confidence, I think, comes down to part of you as a person. So I think that has to be worked on. One thing I often say is that you can know everything in the world, but if you can't communicate it, what's the point?
Yeah.
And in football, that is absolutely relevant because you can be a great data analyst. You can be really good at understanding exactly what it tells you on the screen. You can have everything ready to just give give that message to the players or to a manager or a coach. But then if you get there and you fumble and you can't really talk and you're like you're really twitchy and there's a lack of confidence, you start sweating, it's not going to come across and give just like justification to what you actually wanted to say. So for me, the interpersonal side is the key thing. I always give an example of an experience that I had with a student from many, many years ago at my first institution that I taught at. And he went for an internship. So the program that I was on at the time was kind of a 3-year, but there was an option for like a sandwich in the middle. Got interviewed for a position. In the interview, came across quite arrogant, quite cocky. Didn't get the position. However, the person that did get offered it ended up having to pull out. They got a second chance. So that person, about 12 months later, they were completely different. They looked very mellowed. It looks like they'd been in an environment where it was very egotistical, and they'd been kind of, you know, you need to know your place type situation. That person is now head of analysis in the MLS, and it's like his immediate impression wasn't great, and it was just a stroke of luck that he got the second bite of the cherry, really. So yeah, for me, that interpersonal side is massive, because if you come across in a certain way, that can be the breaker, really.
Yeah. I remember there was a quote that my headmaster at school always stuck with me, and it relates to what you just said, is that they won't remember what you say, but they'll remember your energy. And you mentioned that element of like going to speak to parents and being nervous and stuff like that. They'll remember your energy and who you are and your confidence and your ability to communicate. Yeah. Very much aligns to what you said.
Yeah, we had a visit a few months ago at UCFE from Stuart Bedlam, who was at Coventry and then at Blackpool in a recruitment role. And one of the things he said was, a couple of, not too long ago actually, people were hired based on their personalities. Because you can teach someone how to code, you can teach someone how to do all the kind of technical bits that you need them to do. He said, but if we can't get on with you, you're either going to end up being very isolated in a group. You'll end up being someone who no one comes to because they don't find you approachable. So all those kind of interpersonal soft skills are absolutely fundamental, because you can learn the rest.
What does the future hold for scouting then? So obviously you mentioned your journey so far up to a point. I'm sure there's many, many years ahead in this area. But what do you think the future holds for this growth of the sporting field?
I think there'll be more emphasis on the development of assessing potential rather than performance. It's already there now, but I think there has to come a point where you can watch a game and you can spot the best player. And that's just a momentary, that's what they're doing right now. But what is it that we're looking for to be able to say, yeah, they're all right, but actually I can also see that in the future they're going to become something a lot better. I think there'll be more work done around that, because that is where the kind of money aspect comes in for a lot of clubs. The sooner you get a player, the more money they're going to make you if they turn into something bigger. Equally, the sooner you get a player, the cheaper they're going to be. So there's a financial kind of implication there as well. I think that with the women's side, I think there's a lot more scope for career paths for women in the women's game, not just for women, for men as well. But I think that's kind of a huge area that's going to grow. As the game grows and evolves, there's going to be more opportunity to get more opportunities at domestic level, international level. Domestic level, believe it or not, is really sparse for scouts for women. There's clubs in the WSL that don't have any scouts.
Really?
So it's very thin on the ground. So you would like to think that's going to get even bigger and create opportunities for people that actually want to do it. That's kind of where I see it going in terms of the evolution of potential is really important, and there's such a key part of that being done right. But then also the women's side, the evolution of that and the growth of it should bring scouts that the men's game have already got.
Okay.
Because, there's a lot of catching up to do.
Just on that, what's the difference between domestic and international? You mentioned your two different roles, obviously male and female.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the way that you approach certain things?
So as a scout, I've noticed a difference. Obviously for United, I was, it was very domestic, so it was them. And for the FA, it's international. So what I've noticed in those two roles in particular, you might have a very distinct profile that you're looking for. So, for example, like England have got the DNA that they look for, and we have that then as the blueprint. So it kind of feels like there is something to work with. But then domestically, you've got, United that, I always see United as kind of like they're looking for like the Paul Scholes type player, like stocky, technical, like a lot of movement, creative, etc. So you've got kind of from a scouting perspective those profiles to work with, but equally as a scout on both sides of the fence, the way in which you can operate is very different. So as an example, when I go out to games for United, I wasn't allowed to talk to the parents. I wasn't allowed to talk to the coaches. You were put usually in a corner where the viewing's really tough. Some clubs made it really difficult, started mowing the grass behind you so you couldn't actually hear the names. Yeah. And if you're at younger games, you don't get a team sheet. So you've been sent to watch Charlie. Oh, there's 3 Charlies on the pitch. Like, I don't like which. And then if that mower's going off behind you, like you can't even hear it anyway. So that's kind of the domestic side. Internationally, very different. You can go and talk to the coaches. When you get to the game, you can go and introduce yourself to the coach. You can ask about the players. When the game's ended, you can ask the coaches, is that normally how they play? So you can get some more information. And it's because domestically they see you as a threat. You're gonna take our players. Internationally, that's a good thing for the club. The players are going to be international. So there's kind of the negative and the positive of depending who you're there for.
Interesting. Good point, yeah. Final question then. So I always ask my guests this. So the day comes when you kind of put your feet up, Danielle. You say, I've done my bit in scouting, done my bit in academia. How would you like to be remembered in this field?
I think I'm the first female scout that's been at United.
Okay.
So that's quite a nice legacy, and I quite like that. I also think that I'd like to be seen as someone who didn't allow barriers to stop them. Tried to create an environment where females feel like anything can be achieved. The fact you're female shouldn't mean that you can't enter the male game. And I always use this, you're in these environments because of your brain, and I don't know if there is such thing as a male or a female brain, but it's a brain. And that's what you're there for. So I don't really see how that matters, to be honest. And that's kind of, a lot of the messaging that I would like to put across. But I think just someone who tried to create opportunities, tried to give the right sort of information, but also helpful information. So, yeah, I kind of want to see myself as a, people's person. Someone who's doing stuff for the greater good and for the right reasons, not just to say I'm a United. I don't want that. I think I don't really talk about it a lot. I don't really talk about the United stuff a lot unless someone asks me. The amount of times that I've been in a situation where it happens quite a lot on holiday.
Okay.
So you around people that are like debating, United shouldn't have bought them, they should be doing it. And it's kind of nice to just like not say anything. So it's nice to just be in the background of hearing that, as you say, outsider perspective in. And it's, I'm happy with, achievements in that side of things so far. But I also think that there's a lot more to be done on a bigger scale, maybe, especially in the women's game.
It's good that you can detach yourself from your footballing identity and who you are. Some people struggle with that, Some people struggle to detach yourself. So I think it's a unique skill. Just want to say thank you for speaking. I think you speak very elegantly, and you're actually, but you are very, very intelligent in terms of how you come across, and it's good to see that the growth of obviously scouting has come apparent and it's benefited you. But also I like the fact that you mentioned the element of being a female in the game and some of those potential obstacles that are only going to inspire next generation or the people that are potentially watching or listening to this podcast. So wish you all the best, Danielle.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Good luck and thank you for your time.
Brilliant.